Welcome back to another episode of Dreading, or if this is your first time here, welcome. Today we are going to be covering the case of Jack the Ripper, which is by far the most famous unsolved case of all time. This has been, by and large, our most requested case, given that it's one most people know. Even if you aren't interested in true crime, even if you don't like to hear about murders, you've likely stumbled upon Jack the Ripper through some other avenue. Jack the Ripper has been somewhat of a murderous icon in the time that has passed since his crimes, to the point that he is regularly featured among horror movie characters like the creature from the Black Lagoon, Professor Moriarty, real holographic simulated Evil Lincoln, and of course, Dracula. The case has been featured in Saturday morning cartoons, and there are some people who aren't even aware that he was a real person, who really killed multiple women in the 1800s. People are so divorced from the time frame of the murders and the victims themselves that they treat the case like a game of Clue, and people have been attempting to solve the murders for over a century. With that in mind, we're going to cover the case in as much detail as possible today, and go over all the relevant theories tomorrow. Originally, we did plan on making this one long video. However, upon scripting it out, we found that it made more sense to split it into two. I strongly encourage those watching who are already apprised of the case details to leave your favorite theories in the comments down below, as there are truly hundreds, and we will likely miss many. Because this case took place in the late 1800s, there's no definitive way to solve it, and even if there was, people would likely not accept the answers that they were given, because speculation is much more interesting. Recently, there was a breakthrough, but from what we've seen while researching this case, many people either don't trust this breakthrough, don't believe that it's real, and feel like there are still a lot of plot holes that weren't properly explained when Jack was supposedly named. If everything goes according to plan, this should be our second upload in our Dreadsgiving celebration, where we upload every day of the last week of November. But knowing our luck, or lack thereof, there might have already been a few hiccups, but fingers crossed. As always, if there is a case you would like to see featured on the channel, or a topic you would like to bring more attention to, email us at dreading.official@gmail.com. We are constantly going through our email, filtering through your suggestions, and adding them to the list of topics that we plan on covering. But please be mindful, my brother and I are not substitute for law enforcement or an investigative agency. We cannot attempt to solve the case, and can only make videos based on already published information surrounding a case. Unfortunately, as this channel has grown, that disclaimer has become necessary to state in the introduction to our videos. Though the vast majority of you do not need it, we appreciate you listening all the same, and apologies to any confusion that our reporting has caused. While all of the sources we used in the completion of this video will be linked in the description box down below, most of the information was taken from jacktheripper.org. So, with all of that said, let us begin. Before we delve into the crimes committed by the Ripper, it's important to note the time in which they took place. No murder, no matter how small, is unaffected by the culture of the people around it, and that is certainly true in this case. The living conditions in East London in 1888 could only be described as horrendous, driven by the toxic mix of poverty, overpopulation, industrialization, and systemic neglect. The area was filled to the brim with people trying to make a living and failing miserably. The vast majority of people filling the streets during this time didn't choose to make it their home, rather were stuck there due to the circumstances beyond their control, and soon the streets were overcrowded and dangerous. East London experienced a massive influx of people during the 19th century, fueled by industrialization and migration. The Industrial Revolution attracted thousands seeking work, and the promise of prosperity was a cruel illusion to most. Immigrants, particularly Irish laborers and Eastern European Jews fleeing persecution, crowded into the area. The majority of Irish men and women who came to the area had been escaping the Irish famine, which had occurred years earlier. The aftermath of the famine was profound, and many Irish families who were reliant on farming during that time found themselves evicted and impoverished. Compounding these economic hardships were political challenges. The push for Irish Home Rule and the associated violence during this time period created a volatile environment that spurred emigration. Many left Ireland not only to escape poverty, but also to avoid social unrest and instability tied to the Irish nationalist struggle. During this time, London appeared to many as being a refuge for those who had lost their ability to provide for themselves and their families. There was a high demand for unskilled labor throughout the city, and so men and women alike moved there, believing that they would find a more stable income. At the same time, a significant portion of Jewish immigrants coming to East London came from the Russian Empire, escaping anti-Semitic persecution. The assassination of Tsar Alexander II in 1881 led to a rise in violent anti-Semitic pogroms, particularly in the Pale of Settlement, a region where Jews were legally confined. During this time, Jews faced oppressive laws that restricted their ability to work or own land or participate in public life. Quotas on education and limits on urban residency further marginalized Jewish communities. Combined with endemic poverty and economic exploitation, life became untenable for many, prompting waves of migration in search of safety and opportunity. Both sets of immigrants came to East London looking for opportunity and a better life, but found nothing in return. In fact, these groups were viewed by Londoners as being infiltrators, taking their jobs and resources maliciously. By 1888, Whitechapel was densely populated, with an estimated 80,000 immigrants crammed into a space ill-equipped to support them. Housing was insufficient and poorly constructed, with many living in a single room or shared accommodations known as doss houses, where dozens might sleep in squalid, unsanitary conditions. Families would often squeeze themselves into one small room in order to save money, and it was common to have 9 people living in one room. Incest was also, unfortunately, extremely common. Conditions were so poor that the majority of residents featured cellars that were filled with liquid sewage that would spill inside. The majority of East London's residents lived in grinding poverty. Work was scarce, irregular, and poorly paid, often limited to labor-intensive jobs in factories, sweatshops, or on the docks. Women faced even bleaker prospects, frequently forced into prostitution, and while technically prostitution was legal, solicitation was not. Oftentimes, if a man was unable to support his wife and children, she would be forced into prostitution in order to support the family as best they could. The bleak circumstances, mixed with the fact that they couldn't provide for their families, would lead most men to alcoholism, and then taking their frustration and anger out on their wives, who they would also grow resentful towards. It was especially common during this time to see the men abusing their wives and kids, to the point where most people would turn a blind eye to it. The lack of a stable income meant that families lived hand-to-mouth, unable to afford decent housing, food, or medical care. Children often went barefoot and hungry, and disease such as tuberculosis and cholera were rampant, thriving in the filthy environment. The majority of children in the area would die before the age of 5, either from exhaustion, disease, or chronic starvation. The infrastructure of East London was woefully inadequate to support its burgeoning population, which only amplified tensions in the area. Open sewers, piles of uncollected garbage, and polluted drinking water created an environment rife with health hazards. The narrow, labyrinth streets were dark, damp, and unventilated, creating ideal conditions for the spread of disease. Public health initiatives were either non-existent or insufficient, as the government's laissez-faire attitude left the poorest to fend for themselves. Those were problems that the government largely felt would solve themselves, to an extent. Those in power felt that it was the fault of those who were poor for being that way, and that if disease spread so rampantly that the majority of them perished, that it was God's way of solving the problem. They felt that any sort of help would simply be a waste of time and resources, so easily solved issues would go largely unsolved. Every group blamed the other for what was occurring, and violence, domestic assault, and rape amongst the people was incredibly commonplace. So commonplace that when a man started to violently murder women on the street, no one could definitively say who it was. Before we discuss the crimes that are mostly associated with Jack the Ripper, we first have to discuss 2 murders that occurred directly before them and are often associated with him. We will keep this as comprehensive as we can, while also being brief, as these murders were likely not done by the Ripper. Emma Elizabeth Smith was a 45-year-old widow who had been a resident of East London for over a year. She worked as an unfortunate, which was a term that referred to a woman who had fallen on hard times and had no ability to provide for herself save for prostitution. Emma's line of work often led to her being brutalized, with friends recalling her returning to home with black eyes and bruises often. She would also state that on one occasion, a client had thrown her out of a window. Emma was described as withdrawn and secretive about her life, even to those closest to her. Although she was known to drink, she was never truly open to those around her, keeping the details of her private life close to the chest. Emma was said to have been working early in the morning of April 3, 1888, when she was spotted talking to a man wearing dark clothing and a white neckerchief. Shortly thereafter, she would return to her doss house, bleeding from her face and abdomen. Emma told a friend that she'd been assaulted by a group of young men, who had struck her repeatedly with some blunt instrument. She went further to say that the group of men had robbed her prior to the assault. Despite her wounds, she was apprehensive about going to the hospital, and only went after her friend refused to drop the subject. When she was admitted to the hospital, the gravity of her wounds were properly realized. Her right ear had been torn, and multiple of her internal organs had been ruptured due to the assault. She told the doctors the same story about the assault, and claimed that while she didn't know the men that attacked her, the youngest one in the group could not have been more than 19 years old. After a day in the hospital, Emma would die of her injuries, and the details of the murder would be publicized. People generally were outraged about the murder, but the articles talking about it mostly discussed it as being particularly Emma's fault, that she had sunk so low to be a prostitute, and she should have expected the assault as part of the job. But this was just the first in a long line of murders that gained public attention during this time. The second murder was that of Martha Tabram. Martha was 39 years old when she was murdered, and was similarly described as an unfortunate. Martha was also an alcoholic, which led to the demise of her first marriage, as well as her later relationship with a man named William Turner. William would state that if he were to ever give Martha any money, she would immediately spend it on alcohol, even if they had more pressing needs. He learned not to trust her with their money, and because of that, she would often take it upon herself to find her own ways of getting liquor. Martha's drinking led William to leave her multiple times over, only returning due to periods of sobriety. It was reported that in the last few weeks of Martha's life, she had begun drinking once again, and William had once again left her. With no other way to support herself, Martha had become a prostitute once more, and on August 7, 1888, had been seen in the company of two military men. She was last seen with one of the soldiers, going into the entrance of George Yard, a thoroughfare known to be incredibly dangerous during that time. This street was usually frequented by prostitutes, as there were multiple alleyways and small areas in which you could avoid notice. At around 4:45 a.m., Martha's body would be found on the street, lying on her back in a pool of blood. She had been stabbed 39 times in the chest, throat, and abdomen. Whoever killed her used two different knives, one being described as an ordinary pocket knife, while the other was a long bayonet or a dagger. Once more, the sheer brutality of the murder gained public attention, especially when it was publicized that she had been last seen in the company of a soldier. Though the police attempted to identify the men she'd been last seen with, they failed to make any headway. Martha's murder occurring so closely to Emma's made people uncomfortable, and many felt as if tensions were on the rise, and things would only get worse from there. The canonical 5 refers to the 5 agreed-upon victims of Jack the Ripper, although many suspect there are more, which we will also be going over. It's also important to note that the term canonical now is usually used in the discussion of fictional universes and stories, but the origin of the term refers to things deemed good and accurate. This factors into the reporting, as people have argued that calling the victims the canonical 5 is disrespectful and treats them as if they were fictional characters, rather than real women who were brutally killed. However, at the time the women were given this name, the term was used to mean that these were the accepted and recognized victims of the Ripper. The first agreed-upon victim was Mary Ann Nichols, who most knew by the name Polly. Like most people living in East London during the 1880s, the 43-year-old had fallen on hard times. She had married a man named William Nichols and had 5 children with the printer. However, shortly after the birth of their 5th child, Mary would catch William having an affair with a woman that she employed to help take care of the children. This discovery was said to have rocked her, and led to her drinking heavily. She felt betrayed by the person she loved the most, and worst of all, she felt as if it was somehow her fault. Mary and William's marriage would disintegrate after that. Mary's father would state that William took their children and left her to be with the woman he had an affair with, which only hurt Mary more. William would deny this, and state that while he did briefly leave her, she forgave him and took him back. He then left her months later, due to her excessive drinking. Regardless of who left who, the couple separated, and Mary would go on to live with her father for some time, before being forced out of his house after a confrontation. In 1887, she would start another relationship, this time with a widower and a father of 3, but that too would be destroyed by Mary's relationship with alcohol. However, in April of 1888, Mary's life began to turn around. She was hired to work as a domestic servant to a couple living in Wandsworth. Shortly after getting the job, she wrote her father the following letter. I just write to you to say that you will be glad to know that I am settled in my new place. I'm going on all right up to now. My people went out yesterday and have not returned, so I am in charge. It's a grand place inside, with trees and gardens back in front. All has been newly done up. They are teetotalers and religious, so I ought to get on. They are very nice people, and I have not too much to do. I hope you're all right and the boy has work, so goodbye for the present. From yours truly, Polly. But her good fortune would not last. Her employers were teetotalers, which meant that they did not drink, which would make Mary's reliance on alcohol an issue. She would be fired after just 3 months of work, and would reportedly steal a variety of items from the home before leaving, a fact that she also relayed to her father via postcard. Mary had stopped caring for herself, and by the beginning of August 1888, she found herself going between 2 common houses, depending upon her ability to pay. Like Elizabeth Smith, Mary was an unfortunate. On August 31st, 1888, Mary had been kicked out by the boarding housekeeper, as she hadn't yet paid her rent. She would be told that she would be welcomed back once she paid the 4 pence she was due, which she readily agreed to. Before leaving, Mary was said to have put on a bonnet, one that she had never been seen wearing before, and told other residents that she believed the bonnet would be the key to her making the rent money and more that night, and it would seem that she was proven right. At 2:30 a.m., she would be seen by a friend of hers named Emily Holland. Mary reportedly approached Emily and declared that that night she had made 3 times the amount she needed to pay her rent, but had spent it on alcohol instead. Emily would state that Mary was so inebriated that she could barely stand up straight, but when she tried to get her friend back to the Doss house, the 43-year-old refused. She was adamant that she would get the money to pay the landlord that night and shuffled drunkenly into the night. That would be the last time she would be seen alive, or one of the last times. Less than an hour later, a man named Charles Allen Cross would find Mary lying on the ground in front of a gated stable on Bucks Woe. Allen was reportedly walking home from a pub when he came upon Mary's body laying flat on her back with her eyes open, legs straight, and her skirt raised above her knees. He stated that he was perplexed by the sight, as she appeared unconscious, and would call a passing cart driver named Robert Paul over to her body, wanting to see if he knew what was wrong with the woman. The two men looked over Mary's body as she lay on the cobblestone, and Cross would state that he touched her face, which was warm, and her hands, which were cold. Cross would later tell the man that he thought Polly was dead, but Paul believed that she might have just passed out after a rambunctious night of drinking. After some discussion, they thought it would be in their best interest to find a police officer, but before leaving, they would pull Mary's skirt down, covering her body out of respect. They eventually found a police officer and informed him of the scene. Cross would be quoted as saying, "She looks to me to be either dead or drunk, but for my part, I believe she's dead." While Paul and Cross were informing the officer of the discovery, another officer was making the rounds and had discovered Mary's body for himself, although he noted far more injuries than the other two men. Mary's throat had been slashed so deeply that her head was nearly severed, and she was surrounded by her own blood. The scene was gruesome, and her cause of death was blatantly obvious. The officers similarly touched Mary's body and found that her legs were still warm, meaning that she'd been dead for at most 30 minutes. Both Cross and Paul would state that when they had happened upon Mary's body, her throat had not been cut, and there were no visible wounds to her person. Though they believed that she was dead when they found her, they were adamant that they would have noticed such severe injuries, especially since they had lingered around her body, meaning that in between the time they had left her in the road and when the other officer found her, her killer had struck. It is widely believed that he had attacked her prior to the men finding her, but heard them approaching, and hid nearby as they examined her, then finished his attack once they left. However, other people believe that Mary had passed out drunk prior to the men finding her, and it was only after they left that the killer happened upon her body. But there was more to her murder. After Nichols' body was moved to the mortuary, they were able to find more injuries. Her face had been bruised by what appeared to be a fist before her throat was cut, meaning that the killer likely held her face in place while doing so. Her genitals had been stabbed repeatedly, and she had been disemboweled by either a cork cutter or a shoemaker's knife. The wounds were precise, as if done by a doctor, and the cuts left most of the organs perfectly intact, as if they were made by a surgeon. The injuries had been successfully concealed by Mary's dress, and again, Robert and Charles were adamant that they were not there when they initially discovered the body. The doctor performing the autopsy would state that based on her injuries, the murderer had likely attacked Mary from behind, likely covering her mouth with one hand as he slit her throat. The cuts were so deep she likely died immediately, at which point he lifted her dress and began to mutilate her body post-mortem. He determined the attack would have taken mere minutes to occur. The murder of Polly Nichols sent shockwaves through the already tense and overcrowded Whitechapel district. While violent crime was not uncommon in the area, the brutal and deliberate nature of her killing was unprecedented. Scotland Yard was quickly called in to investigate the case. However, they ran into multiple issues early on in their investigation. The first issue was that the majority of the crime scene evidence had been completely destroyed in the direct aftermath. After Mary's body had been taken to the mortuary, the sidewalk where she was murdered had been washed down by a well-meaning resident, meaning that if the killer had left any footprints in the blood, or any evidence as to who he was, it had been washed away. Secondly, prior to the body being properly examined, 2 of the workhouse paupers, who have since been described as senile, stripped the body of its clothing and fully washed it down before disposing of the garments completely, which meant that any evidence left directly on the body was also lost. All the investigators had to go on was eyewitness testimony, which was shaky at best. Again, the attack would have happened in the early morning hours of August 31st, when most people who were out were likely drunk. Even still, had someone heard anything alarming, it was likely that they would have written it off as being a domestic violence situation, and thought better than to report it. However, the investigation did find 3 potential witnesses early on. In an adjacent street, 3 men were said to have been working at the time of the murder. These men were Harry Tompkins, James Mumford, and Charlie Bitton. However, all men claimed that they heard and saw nothing of note during that time. At first, the investigators didn't believe their version of events, and thought it was impossible that one or all 3 of the men had likely killed Mary themselves. In their minds, a murder this brutal could not have simply occurred so swiftly as to not bring attention. All the men would be taken into custody and questioned separately. Eventually, they would be eliminated as suspects. Another man who was questioned in connection to the crime was Patrick Mulshaw, a night watchman in the area. He too stated that he hadn't seen or heard anything suspicious at the time of the murders, cementing the idea that whoever killed Mary had done so quickly and quietly. With nothing else to go on, the police constables began to question prostitutes in the area, specifically if they had seen or dealt with anyone who had been overtly aggressive with them. Because Mary had been working that night, they thought it was likely that whoever murdered her did so because they knew her profession. And given the brutality of the crime, they suspected that this was not the first time this person had assaulted a prostitute. Through this line of inquiry, the investigators were given a name, Leather Apron. Leather Apron was the nickname that the prostitutes in Whitechapel had given to a man named Jack Pitzer. They gave him this name because he would routinely approach prostitutes while wearing a leather apron and carrying a butcher knife, before threatening to kill them if they didn't hand over all of their earnings. He had done this multiple times, and had found it to be so profitable that he had stopped working entirely. But the police were not the only people looking into the crime. The brutality of Mary's murder drew the attention of the general public, who flocked to the scene of the crime in the hopes of getting some sort of memento. Seeing the public's morbid excitement over the crime, reporters flocked to the area, hoping to get some sort of scoop. The Sunderland Daily Echo would publish the first report using the name Leather Apron the day following Mary's murder, writing, quote, "The women in a position similar to that of the deceased allege that there is a man who goes by the name of Leather Apron, who has more than once attacked unfortunate and defenseless women. His dodge is, it is asserted, to get them into some house on the pretense of offering them money. He then takes whatever little they have and half kills them in addition." The very next night, a woman would reportedly identify Leather Apron to the police, stating that she knew he was the killer, as she had personally had run-ins with him in the past. The officer she approached disregarded her claims for the most part, and even though she implored him to take some action, they ultimately did nothing with the information. With no other discernible leads, and a catchy nickname to attach to the crime, multiple publications began to write about Leather Apron. The following is an article, as found on jacktheripper.org. Leather Apron by himself is quite an unpleasant character, if, as many of the people suspect, he's the real author of the 3 murders which, in everybody's judgment, were done by the same person. He is a more ghoulish and devilish brute than can be found in all the pages of shocking fiction. He has ranged Whitechapel for a long time. He exercises over the unfortunates who ply their trade after 12 o'clock at night, a sway that is based on universal terror. He is a character so much like the invention of a story writer that the accounts of him given by all the streetwalkers of the Whitechapel district seem like romances. The remarkable thing is, however, that they all agree in every particular. Ever since the last murder, the name Leather Apron has been falling repeatedly on the ears of the reporters. His expression is sinister. He seems to be full of terror for all the women who describe it. His eyes are small and glittering. His lips are usually parted with a grin, which is not only not reassuring, but excessively repellent. He is a slipper maker by trade, but does not work. His business is blackmailing women late at night. A number of men in Whitechapel follow this interesting profession. He has never cut anybody so far as known, but always carries a leather knife, presumably as sharp as leather knives are wont to be. This knife a number of women have seen. His name nobody knows, but all are united in the belief that he is a Jew or of Jewish parentage, his face being of a marked Hebrew type. But the most singular characteristic of the man, and one which tends to identify him closely with last Friday night's work, is the universal statement that in moving about he never makes any noise. What he wears on his feet, the women do not know, but they all agree that he moves noiselessly. His uncanny peculiarity to them is that they never see him or know of his presence until he is close by them. The publication's description of Leather Apron stirred anti-Semitic sentiments in the community, and members of the public were quick to accuse any Jewish man on the street of being responsible for the murder of Mary, as well as Martha and Emma. There were rumors that the murders were actually Jewish ritual killings, which led to multiple mobs being formed. A day later, the real Leather Apron was identified as being Jack Pitzer, although he had not been found by police. According to one of the investigators, Jack was well known in the area for going by the nickname Leather Apron, as he wore it for his job as a shoe finisher. However, they had an issue apprehending him immediately, as he went into hiding after the first article had been printed, naming him as Mary's killer. Despite a man being named as a suspect, tension still rose, with many innocent men being accused of murder because they were Jewish. However, Jack's own innocence would be proven, as another murder was set to take place. Annie Chapman was a 47-year-old woman who had been living at Corsingham's lodging house for a few months prior to her murder. Like the other victims, Annie had a weakness for alcohol and was working as a prostitute, but also enjoyed selling her crocheted goods. In the days leading up to Annie's death, she had gotten into a small spat with another woman staying at the lodging house over borrowed soap and had been struck in the face by the other woman. Friends of Annie would state that in the days that followed, the injuries seemed to get worse, and Annie's health seemed to be failing. She was considering going to get medical attention after being unable to eat, and she would state that she was too ill to do anything, but would be murdered before she could do so. On September 8th, Annie would leave the lodging house around 2 a.m. with the intention of earning the money she needed to pay her rent. She would tell a fellow lodger to hold a bed for her, as she would be back relatively soon, but she would never make her return. She was reportedly seen talking to a man at 5:30 a.m., who was described as being over 40 years old, only slightly taller than she was, with long dark hair, and a quote, foreign shabby genteel appearance, unquote. He was supposedly wearing a low-crowned deerstalker hat and a dark coat. However, this would be the last time that Annie would be seen alive. Just before 6 a.m., an elderly man would happen upon Annie's dead body. She was lying on her back on the ground, with her hands raised, as if she had fought off her attacker. Her hands and face were covered in blood. Her dress had been lifted, exposing her lower body. Her throat had been slashed like Mary's, only this time, a white handkerchief was tied around her neck, which might have been to stop her head from rolling away from the body. She had also been disemboweled, and a significant portion of her intestines had been thrown over her shoulder like a scarf. They also found, upon further examination, that her uterus was missing and had been expertly removed from her body. That fact is debated by some who have studied this case. Some believe that the womb was not removed from the body at the crime scene, but was later removed by the mortuary staff to sell illegally. They feel as if this is much more plausible, and that the missing organ was erroneously noted down in order to disguise their own crimes. It's also notable that after Annie's murder and the discovery of the missing uterus, the coroner would state publicly that in the weeks prior, he had heard about an American doctor offering medical schools in the area wombs that he had somehow procured. This doctor was never identified, and when the medical schools in the area were approached about this supposed doctor, they claimed to have no knowledge of it. As we stated yesterday in our H.H. Holmes video, medical schools during this time would often use unsavory and illegal practices to get bodies to dissect, meaning that those in charge of these schools would have vested interest in lying, if only to ensure that the public wasn't made aware of their macabre practices. However, if the mortuary staff was stealing body parts, they would also be inclined to make up a rumor about someone who could have motive. It just depends on what you feel is more believable. Either option could be true, or both can be false. It was immediately clear that whoever was responsible for the murder of Mary Nichols had killed Annie Chapman, and that they were quickly escalating. Mary had been killed in a rush, and though her body had been brutalized, Annie's was much worse. Her killer had seemingly taken his time with her, and felt confident enough in his abilities to remove actual organs without gaining any unwanted attention. They also noted that he had killed Annie later in the morning, when more people would be awake and active, showing a fair bit of ego. Whoever was responsible was getting bolder and taunting the police with his crimes. There was one clue left at the scene, which immediately sparked the police's interest: a clean, unused leather apron. The stories of Leather Apron had been printed on every newspaper in London, with most of the reports declaring that he was undoubtedly the murderer, and given the precision and care that was used in the commission of the crime, it was obvious that whoever had left the apron did so on purpose. This killer wouldn't have made such an obvious mistake, unless they purposely wanted to throw the police off, which led the police to the conclusion that whoever the killer was, it likely wasn't Leather Apron, and he was reading all the stories about himself. 2 days later, Jack Pitzer was taken in for questioning, and his home was subsequently searched. Initially, they believed that they had found blood on 5 of his knives, but when they were tested, the stains were shown to be nothing more than rust. Moreover, Jack was able to provide ironclad alibis for the murders, having been seen at a lodging house the night of Mary Nichols' murder, and at a family home the night of Annie's. Multiple independent witnesses could validate his alibi, proving he couldn't possibly be responsible. He was similarly found to be physically unable to carry out the crimes due to his declining health. However, he would later admit to being Leather Apron, meaning that he had likely threatened the prostitutes in the area and stole their money. But despite the police exoneration of Pitzer for the Whitechapel murders, the public would still believe that he was involved based largely on the reporting that had been done around him. Pitzer would spend the rest of his life declaring his innocence, but very few people would listen. With all of the suspects ruled out, and the violence escalating in the area, the public felt compelled to act in their own defense. Multiple vigilance committees were formed, with men taking it upon themselves to walk the streets at night in the hopes of keeping the residents safe. The most notable of these groups was the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, which formed in the wake of the Annie Chapman murders. The following is an editorial that was published on September 8, 1888. Now there is only one thing to be done at this moment, and we can talk of larger reforms when we do away with the centralized, non-efficient military system, which Sir Charles Warren has brought to perfection. The people of the East End must become their own police. They must form themselves at once into vigilance committees. There should be a central committee, which should map out the neighborhoods into districts, and appoint the smaller committees. These again should at once devote themselves to volunteer patrol work at night, as well as to general detective service. The unfortunates who are the objects of the man-monster's malignity should be shadowed by one or two of the amateur patrols. They should be cautioned to walk in couples. Whistles and a signaling system should be provided, and means of summoning a rescue force should be at hand. We are not sure that every London district should not make some effort of the kind, for the murderer may choose a fresh quarter now that Whitechapel is being made too hot to hold him. We don't think that the police will put any obstacle in the way of this volunteer assistance. They will probably be only too glad to have their efforts supplemented by the spontaneous action of the inhabitants. But in any case, London must rouse itself. No woman is safe while this ghoul is abroad. Up, citizens, then, and do your own police work. The Whitechapel Vigilance Committee took their jobs seriously, and each member was given a particular beat, and was armed with a police whistle, a pair of galoshes, as well as a strong stick, should they run into the killer themselves. They would meet nightly, and begin their patrols at midnight, but the committee went beyond just patrols. The elected chairman of the group was a local builder, named George Lusk, and he routinely would speak to the press about how the police service was inadequate and how the government at large was not offering a reward for information regarding the identity of the Ripper. They argued that the Ripper threat was not being taken seriously because he was killing the lower class, and argued how quickly the case would be solved if the killer was going after high-class women and girls. The increased presence of men on the street helped some residents feel safe, and in the following weeks, attacks of any kind were down. People were on edge, but days turned into weeks with no sign of the Ripper. They began to feel as if the killing spree was over. The men and women of London began to relax, and though they still had to deal with the immense poverty, discrimination, and disease, they felt as if the real danger had finally passed. But unfortunately, they were wrong. On September 27th, the Central News Agency would receive a letter, written in red ink, which reportedly had been sent from the killer. This letter has been labeled the Dear Boss letter, and was far and away not the only communication that the media had received from someone claiming to be the murderer. But something about this letter itself stood out. The following are its contents. Dear Boss, I keep on hearing how the police have caught me, but they won't fix me just yet. I have laughed when they look so clever and talk about being on the right track. That joke about Leather Apron gave me real fits. I am down on whores, and I shan't quit ripping them until I do get buckled. Grand work the last job was. I gave the lady no time to squeal. How can they catch me now? I love my work and want to start again. You will soon hear from me and my funny little games. I saved some of the proper red stuff in a ginger bottle over the last job to write with, but it went thick like glue and can't use it. Red ink is fit enough, I hope. Ha ha. The next job I do, I shall clip the lady's ears off and send to the police officers, just for jolly. Wouldn't you? Keep this letter back till I do more work. Then give it out straight. My knife's so nice and sharp, I want to get to work right away if I get the chance. Good luck. Yours truly, Jack the Ripper. Don't mind giving me a trade name. Wasn't good enough to post this before I got all the red ink off my hands. Curse it, no luck yet. They say I'm a doctor now. Ha ha. At first, they felt like the letter was more or less a hoax. Just someone trying to insert themselves into an investigation because they were bored and didn't understand the gravity of what was going on. But the letter seemed to have known information about the crimes that weren't well publicized. The fact that the writer acknowledged the leather apron theory in the quote, after purposely leaving a leather apron at the second crime scene, seemed to indicate that they were written by the same person, and so 2 days after receiving it, they would give the letter over to the police. Because the Ripper hadn't struck in a few weeks, the police were quick to determine that the letter was fraudulent, but they would quickly be proven wrong. On September 30th, the very next day, the Ripper would strike twice in 1 hour. The first victim of the night, and third victim in the Ripper murders, was Elizabeth Stride. Elizabeth was a Swedish woman who had immigrated to London under unknown circumstances, as she gave different reasoning depending upon the person she was talking to. A vast amount of Elizabeth's life is unknown, as it seems that she was prone to lie to those around her. In her youth, she had worked as both a servant and a prostitute in Sweden, and would move to London in 1866 for unknown reasons. Long Liz, as she was called, would give various answers to that particular question throughout her life, and it would seem that she preferred for people to know as little about her as possible. In 1869, she would get married to a man named Thomas Stride. The two would own and operate a popular coffee shop in the city. 10 years later, though, the two would attempt to con their insurance by stating that their two children had been killed in a boat crash that had recently occurred. This claim was later debunked, as Liz would petition the Swedish church for financial assistance, citing her husband's failing health, and the marriage would break down from there. After leaving her husband, Elizabeth would get into another relationship, this time with a man named Michael Kidney. Michael was physically abusive towards her, and she would eventually leave him. But with nothing else to fall back on, Elizabeth would get back into prostitution when she couldn't make a living cleaning boarding houses. On the night of September 29th, Liz had spent a considerable amount of time getting ready to go out. She donned a black jacket and skirt, as well as a black bonnet, and many of her fellow residents at the Doss house would state that she looked impeccable when she left the home at 7 p.m. For the next few hours, Elizabeth was seen in the company of multiple men, all suspected to be her clients for the night. At 11 p.m., she was spotted by Jay Best and John Gardner with an unknown man. They would describe this man as being short with a dark mustache, and that he was sporting a morning suit and a bowler hat. 45 minutes later, she would be seen with another man by William Marshall. Marshall would later tell the police that this man was decently dressed, wearing a peaked cap, a black coat, and dark trousers. He also claimed that he witnessed the two share multiple kisses that night, with the man telling her after one, quote, "You would say anything but your prayers," unquote. At midnight, a shopkeeper would state that he sold Elizabeth and a man some grapes, but was unable to give a proper description of this man, or state if he matched the previous description given by Marshall. This sighting has fallen under much speculation, because it was later determined that Elizabeth had not held, swallowed, nor consumed grapes prior to her death. His description of the man she was seen with was also notably different, and he would give contradictory stories to the police and to the press. When he had been approached by the police about the night of the murder, he claimed that he had closed his shop earlier that night, without ever seeing Elizabeth or anything suspicious. However, when he spoke to the private detectives and reporters, he told them the story about the grapes. Many enthusiasts who look into this case therefore doubt the veracity of his statements, and believe that he lied about seeing Elizabeth that night at all, in order to insert himself into the investigation. That sort of behavior was exceptionally commonplace, with police often receiving false tips and information throughout their investigation. On the one hand, people wanted to help, so they would approach officers with unrelated stories, feeling as if they were the key to breaking the case. But on the other, many people were just bored, and thought of the murders happening in their area as entertainment more than anything. Many of the people who would insert themselves this way were not vulnerable to falling victim to the Ripper, and therefore felt excited by the prospect of living through such a horrific killing spree. 30 minutes later, she was seen standing outside with a man by Police Constable William Smith. Smith would state that the man matched the previous description given by Marshall, and was carrying a long package with him, and the two were hanging out in front of the International Working Men's Education Club, a socialist and Jewish establishment. He went further to describe the man as being, at most, 5'7", and around 18 years old, with a dark complexion and a small, dark mustache. Smith would state that the couple did nothing to arouse his suspicion, and he quickly moved on from the area. His version of events would be called into question. At the same time, the man was witnessed assaulting Elizabeth by a man named Israel Schwartz. Israel was a Jewish man who had immigrated from Hungary and did not speak English. He would later tell interpreters that he saw the man throw the woman down onto the ground. He described the man as being about 5'5", around 30 years old, with a fair complexion and a dark mustache. Schwartz initially believed that he was witnessing a run-of-the-mill domestic assault, and tried to remove himself from the situation by crossing the street. However, it was then that he saw a second man, standing against a wall, watching the attack while lighting a pipe. This man was said to have been 5'11", around 35 years old, with a fresh complexion. He had light brown hair and a brown mustache. He was said to be sporting a dark overcoat and a black, hard felt hat. Schwartz stated that he attempted to leave. The man attacking Liz stopped, and yelled out to the man watching, who then began to follow Schwartz. At this, Schwartz began to panic, and ran from the area, with the second man giving chase for a few good minutes. And less than 15 minutes later, Stride's dead body would be found, left in the middle of the road with an obvious tear through her throat. When Elizabeth's body was found, she was still warm to the touch, which told the officers that she'd been killed within the last 30 minutes. They also noted that this murder had not been nearly as violent as the previous one, which they took to mean that the person responsible was stopped before he could further desecrate the body. However, at the same time the police were discovering Elizabeth's body, and feeling confident that they were at least able to spook the murderer, another woman was being killed in brutal fashion, nearly a half-mile away. Catherine Eddowes had just been released from police custody due to her drunken antics earlier in the evening. She was said to have been entertaining a crowd with her imitation of a fire engine when she was brought in, and after being placed in a cell, fell into a deep, drunken sleep. At 12 a.m., she awoke and asked to be released, stating that she had sobered up and was ready to go home. As she left the station, one of the officers reprimanded her, telling her that she had no right to get so drunk, and that she'd better go straight home, to which Catherine allegedly replied, quote, "Good night, old cock," unquote. Shortly thereafter, 3 men were said to have seen Catherine talking quietly to another man. 2 of them recalled that Catherine had laid her hand on the man's chest, but felt as if the 2 were up to no good, and left the area without getting a good look at who she was talking to. However, the 3rd was able to get a closer look at the man, and would state that he had, quote, "the appearance of a sailor," unquote. He was around the age of 30, around 5 foot 9 inches, with a fair complexion and a small mustache. He went further to state that he was wearing a red neckerchief, a salt and pepper colored jacket, and a gray peaked cloth cap. This man would tell police that he hadn't seen Catherine's face, but he knew it was her based on the clothing, and despite his detailed description of the man's appearance, would likely be unable to identify the man should he be brought in. However, less than 15 minutes later, Catherine would be dead, meaning that he likely just described Jack the Ripper. At 1:44 a.m., a police constable was doing his rounds when he stumbled onto Catherine's dead body. She was laying on her back in a pool of her own blood, and like every other victim, save for Elizabeth, her dress had been thrown up. And while the police felt as if they were able to stop the Ripper before he had completely destroyed Elizabeth's body, Catherine had not been saved from the same fate. Her throat had been cut from ear to ear, and her torso had been sliced through, with her intestines having been thrown over her shoulder and appeared smeared with fecal matter. Her face had been greatly disfigured, with her nose completely severed. Her cheeks were slashed, and each one of her eyes had been stabbed. The killer had also cut what looked to be an arrow, pointing towards her eyes, into her cheek. They had also removed a portion of her womb as well as her left kidney, and like the letter had mentioned, her earlobes had been cut off. The damage that was done to Catherine's body was severe, and indicated that the killer had no plans to stop due to the added patrols in the area. If anything, he felt brazen enough to kill multiple times throughout the night, as long as it meant properly finishing his plans. Each attack had gotten more and more violent, but they were happening so quickly that the police felt that whoever was responsible must have been a doctor or had some kind of medical training. They had to have some medical knowledge to be able to eviscerate the bodies so expertly, all the while without getting enough blood on their person to draw the attention of those around them. The police mobilized quickly after the discovery of the second body, and one of the only legitimate clues in the case was found a short walk away. A small portion of an apron covered in fecal matter and blood was found on a nearby street at around 2:55 a.m. The patrolman who found the apron had walked the street less than an hour earlier and was adamant that the apron had not been there at the time, meaning that between 2 and 2:55 a.m., the Ripper had made his escape through the area and discarded this small piece of evidence, placing him at the crime scene. With this piece of cloth, the investigators determined that the Ripper likely wore the apron under his oversized jacket, only revealing it when he disrobed. As his victims worked as prostitutes, when they had got to the isolated areas where they were prepared to engage in sexual activity, he would have been expected to take off his jacket and a fair bit of his clothing. With the jacket off, he could then freely murder the woman, staining his clothes and the offending apron with their blood and bodily fluids, then hiding the stains when he made his escape, putting his jacket over the soiled outfit. The discovery of the apron also told the police that whoever the killer was, he escaped notice. After Liz and Catherine's bodies were found, the police fanned out through the area and stopped any man they happened upon. They were sure that they would find the Ripper that night, wanting to ease the public's fears and stop the crime spree once and for all, but each man they questioned was released. Shortly after the discovery of the apron, the police made a second major find, that being of a piece of graffiti that was left on a wall directly above where the soiled apron was found. It read, quote, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." The clue was later labeled the Goulston Street Graffito, and after its discovery, the police constables debated if it would be responsible for them to publicize their findings. Tensions were already high, and after the repeated anti-Semitic sentiments that had been published in the papers, they felt that the message would only lead to more violence. The graffito was found at around 2:30 a.m., and the cops debated until 5 a.m. about what should be done. The city police were of the opinion that because there was so little evidence in this case, everything should be photographed, preserved, and publicized. The public needed to know who to look out for, even if innocent people were to get hurt in the crossfire. But the Metropolitan Police felt differently. They believed that publishing the graffito would lead to a large-scale riot against the Jews, and the head investigator eventually agreed, meaning the graffito was wiped away without any pictures of it being taken. The following day, after determining that the letter that they had received was in fact communication from the killer, the investigators made the decision to publicize the letter. They hoped that maybe someone who read the note would recognize the author and be able to provide them a lead. But instead, the media became obsessed with Jack the Ripper. The very next day, another letter would be received by the Central News Agency. Again, the author had written it in red ink, but carefully placed droplets of blood on the page to confirm his identity. This postcard is often referred to as the Saucy Jack letter, and read, "I was not codding dear old boss when I gave you the tip. You'll hear about Saucy Jackie's work tomorrow. Double event this time. Number 1 squealed a bit and I couldn't finish straight off. Had not the time to get ears for police. Thanks for keeping last letter back till I got to work again. Jack the Ripper." Again, the author of note was giving details about the crime that the public was not aware of, likely why he had killed twice in one night. His reasoning made sense, and we were already aware that Liz's murder had attracted the attention of at least one other person. He killed her quickly to keep her from identifying him later on, and then followed through with his plan on a more easily dominated victim. This letter was also publicized. However, this had the unwanted effect of causing hoaxers from all over the world to reach out with letters of their own, morbidly claiming to be the killer in the hopes of getting their words published. Most of these letters have been made public, and there is a significant amount of debate about which letters are real and which are fake, but the contents of one of the letters would go on to shock the public as well as the police. On October 16th, George Lusk, the elected head of the Mile End Vigilance Committee, would receive a small package that was addressed to him by name alone. This wasn't the first time he had received a letter that was suspicious, as his work often led to his name being published in the papers in conjunction to the case. Hoaxers would routinely seek him out, both in real life and via mail, to try and convince him that they were the real killer. In most cases, their act was not believed. But Lusk had grown alarmed by the attention he had begun to receive. The package smelled horribly, and when he opened it, he found a piece of kidney inside, alongside a letter, and it read, "From hell, Mr. Lusk. Sar, I send you half the kidney I took from one woman. Preserved it for you. T'other piece I fried and ate. It was very nice. I may send you the bloody nif that took it out, if you only wait a will longer. Signed, Catch Me If You Can, Mr. Lusk." At first, he disregarded the package, believing it to be some sort of prank. The purposeful misspellings led him to believe that whoever had sent this was trying to get attention and trying to fit their idea of who the killer was. In his other letters, Jack had not come across as simple, and so this sudden shift was noted. However, when he shared the package with the rest of the Vigilance Committee, they felt different. Though letters claiming to be the killer were a dime a dozen at this point, the fact that someone had sent a piece of an organ made them take the message a bit more seriously. Lusk would eventually take the package, alongside the kidney, to a doctor to assess if it came from a person, and they found that it had. That said, they were able to determine that it didn't belong to any of the victims, as their kidneys had been in horrible condition due to their alcoholism. The doctor who examined the package would later state that the letter was nothing more than a prank, likely orchestrated by a medical student with a morbid fascination with the crime. Once more, there was a significant cooling-off period for the Ripper. More men were organizing and walking the streets at night, in the hopes of being the person to catch the infamous killer. It would be over a month until he killed for the final time, and it would be more brutal than any prior attack. Mary Jane Kelly was a 25-year-old widow who had immigrated to London from Limerick, Ireland, shortly after her husband died. Kelly was described as attractive, cheerful, and well-liked by those who knew her. She sometimes went by the nickname Fair Emma, or Ginger, due to her light complexion and auburn hair. By 1888, she was living in poverty, surviving through prostitution, and residing in the squalid Miller's Court lodging, a single-room space that she rented for 4 shillings and 6 pence per week. She was extremely well-liked, and the only negative thing that people would ever state about her was that she could be tipsy. She was at least 20 years younger than the majority of the victims, was not an alcoholic, and didn't fit the usual victimology of the Ripper. On November 8th, Mary had seen a couple of clients in the room she rented for herself at 13 Miller's Court. But the following morning, when the landlord assistant went up to the room to collect her rent, he was met with a horrifying sight. Before I continue, I want to quickly state that if you've been looking up anything involving these crimes, take special care when looking up Mary Kelly, as pictures of her mutilated body are public and extremely graphic. Most of the other women's photos were not shared in the same way hers were, and it is very easy to accidentally find them. The following is the description as found in the autopsy report. The body was lying naked in the middle of the bed, shoulders flat, but the axis of the body inclined to the left side of the bed. The head was turned on the left cheek. The left arm was close to the body, with the forearm flexed at a right angle and lying across the abdomen. The right arm was slightly abducted from the body and rested on the mattress. The elbow bent and the forearm supine, with the fingers clenched. The legs were wide apart, the left thigh at right angles to the trunk, and the right forming an obtuse angle with the pubes. The whole of the surface of the abdomen and thighs was removed, and the abdominal cavity emptied of its viscera. The breasts were cut off, the arms mutilated by several jagged wounds, and the face hacked beyond recognition of the features. The tissues of the neck were severed all round, down to the bone. The viscera were found in various parts, viz. The uterus and kidneys, with one breast under the head, the other breast by the right foot, the liver between the feet, the intestines by the right side, and the spleen by the left side of the body. The flaps removed from the abdomen and thighs were on the table. The bed clothing at the right corner was saturated with blood, and on the floor beneath was a pool of blood covering about 2 feet square. The face was gashed in all directions, the nose, cheeks, eyebrows, and ears being partly removed. The lips were blanched and cut by several incisions running obliquely down the chin. There were also numerous cuts, extending irregularly across all features. The sheer brutality of the murder was unlike every other victim, as it seemed that this was the first time Ripper could properly take his time with his prey. Previously, his attacks had all taken place on the street, and he was keenly aware that he could be caught at any moment. But with Mary, he could do whatever he wanted, and the result was horrific. However, after Mary Jane's murder, the Ripper would seemingly vanish. 3 more killings would occur in Whitechapel over the next few years, that some would debate was associated with Jack. However, they lacked his particular signature. The case would quickly grow cold, with no evidence to help aid the search for the famed killer. But there were plenty of suspects. If you've made it to this portion of the video, thank you for watching. Part 2 is currently available via Patreon and will be made public tomorrow as part of Dread's Giving. With that said, let us know what you thought of this video by either leaving a like or comment down below. These videos would not be made possible without your support, so your feedback is encouraged. As always, remember, stay safe.